There's a certain kind of connection that feels electric from the very beginning: intense eye contact, undeniable chemistry, moments that feel almost too good to be real. And often, the person at the center of that intensity is someone who, paradoxically, struggles with closeness. These are the individuals who crave connection but fear being consumed by it. They don't just create attraction, they amplify it. And that's where things get complicated. There's something incredibly compelling about a person who shows up with intensity. They look at you like they really see you, they touch you with presence. And in those moments, it feels like there's a depth there that's rare. But what's often happening beneath the surface is not true emotional openness, it's a substitution. Because for someone who struggles with vulnerability, intensity becomes the safer alternative. Vulnerability requires exposure. It means allowing someone to see your fears, your insecurities, your doubts, the parts of you that don't feel polished or in control. And for someone who has built their identity around self-protection, that level of openness feels dangerous. It feels like handing over power. So instead of going there, they find another way to connect that still gives them a sense of closeness without the same level of emotional risk. That's where intensity comes in. Intensity is powerful because it creates a feeling of depth without requiring emotional transparency. It's expressive, it's passionate, it's consuming, but it doesn't necessarily reveal anything real about what's going on inside. It allows them to stay in control while still giving you an experience that feels meaningful, and you feel that. You respond to it. Because when someone is fully present with you in a moment, when their energy is focused, when their attention is undivided, it naturally creates a sense of connection. It feels like intimacy. But here's the subtle difference. True intimacy builds over time through consistency and emotional honesty. Intensity, on the other hand, is immediate. It's fast. It's a surge rather than a steady foundation. So what happens is you begin to associate their intensity with emotional depth. You think, no one could show up like this unless they really feel something. And in a way, they do feel something, but not in a way that's grounded or sustainable. For them, these moments are safe because they exist in a controlled environment. They can turn it on and they can pull back when it starts to feel too real. They don't have to explain themselves. They don't have to stay in the discomfort of emotional exposure. They get to connect on their terms. And the moment things shift toward real vulnerability, when conversations become deeper, when expectations become clearer, when emotional consistency is required, that's when the intensity often fades or becomes inconsistent. Not because the connection meant nothing, but because the way it was built wasn't designed to handle emotional closeness. This is why it can feel so confusing. You're responding to something that felt incredibly real, but you're left trying to understand why that same energy isn't being sustained. The answer isn't that you imagined it. It's that intensity was never meant to carry the weight of real intimacy. And if you don't recognize that distinction, you can find yourself chasing moments that were never meant to become something stable in the first place. There's a very specific emotional rhythm that starts to take hold when you're dealing with someone who moves between closeness and distance. It doesn't feel stable, but it feels powerful. And that's exactly what makes it so hard to walk away from. At first, everything feels natural. They lean in, they show interest, they create moments that feel exciting and full of possibility. You feel chosen? Seen. There's a sense that something meaningful is building. And just as you begin to settle into that feeling, something shifts. They pull back. Not always dramatically. Sometimes it's subtle. Less communication, a slight change in tone, a feeling that their attention isn't where it was before. But you notice it, you feel it, and suddenly, the certainty you were starting to develop turns into a question. What changed? Now here's where the dynamic becomes addictive. Because when they come back, and they almost always do, it feels even more intense than before. That same energy returns, that same connection, that same presence, and it creates relief. It feels like you've regained something valuable, like you've earned your way back into that space with them. And without realizing it, your brain starts to associate their presence with reward. This is the push-pull dynamic at work. The push creates distance, which triggers uncertainty. The pull brings closeness, which creates emotional payoff. And that cycle, uncertainty followed by reward, is one of the most powerful ways to build attachment. You're no longer just enjoying the connection. You're responding to the pattern. You start to invest more, think more, analyze more. You become focused not just on how you feel when things are good, but on how to get back there when things feel off. And that's the shift from connection to pursuit. What makes this even more complex is that the person on the other side isn't always doing this consciously. Their behavior is often driven by an internal conflict. They want connection, but they fear what comes with it. So they move toward you when it feels safe and away when it starts to feel overwhelming. But for you, on the receiving end, it creates instability because consistency is what builds trust. And without consistency, you're left trying to make sense of something that keeps changing. You begin to question your interpretation. You wonder if you did something wrong. You look for patterns, for answers, for ways to stabilize something that by its nature isn't stable. And the hardest part is that the highs feel so convincing. When they're present, it feels real. It feels strong. It feels like something worth holding on to. But those moments are part of the cycle, not a break from it. So you stay, not because it's steady, but because it's intense. And over time, that intensity can start to feel like connection, even when it's actually keeping you in a loop that never fully resolves. There's a paradox at the heart of this dynamic that can be incredibly confusing if you don't see it clearly. The less emotionally available someone is, the more they may lean into physical closeness. And on the surface, that seems contradictory. You would expect emotional openness and physical intimacy to go hand in hand, but in this case, they often move in opposite directions. When someone struggles with emotional closeness, it's not that they don't want connection. It's that emotional intimacy feels unpredictable and exposing. It requires them to stay present in ways they can't fully control. It asks them to communicate what they feel, to be consistent, to remain open even when it's uncomfortable. And for someone who is wired to protect themselves, that level of openness can feel overwhelming. So instead of moving toward emotional closeness, they lean into something that feels safer, physical connection. Because physical intimacy, while intense, has clearer boundaries. It exists in moments. It doesn't demand ongoing emotional availability in the same way. They can fully show up in that space, express desire, create closeness, and then step back without having to navigate the deeper layers of emotional exposure. And this is where it becomes powerful for both of you. When someone who is typically guarded suddenly becomes fully present in a physical moment, it feels significant. It feels like a breakthrough. You interpret that level of closeness as a sign that they're opening up, that they're letting you in. But what's actually happening is that they're engaging in a form of connection that feels intense without requiring vulnerability. They can be passionate without being emotionally transparent. They can create closeness without having to explain themselves. And because of that, they often appear more confident, more expressive, even more connected than they would in an emotionally open conversation. So you begin to associate physical closeness with emotional progress. You think, if we're this close physically, it must mean we're getting closer emotionally. But those two things are not always moving in the same direction. In fact, sometimes the physical connection becomes a way to avoid emotional intimacy altogether. It becomes the space where everything feels good, where there's no pressure to define the relationship, no need to have difficult conversations, no requirement to be consistent outside of those moments. And the moment the connection starts to shift toward something deeper, toward clarity, toward emotional openness, toward real vulnerability, that's when they may begin to withdraw. Not because they don't enjoy the connection, but because it's moving into territory that feels unsafe for them. For you, this creates a mixed signal. You've experienced closeness that felt real, so you expect it to translate into something more stable, more emotionally grounded. But instead, you're met with distance or inconsistency. And that gap between what you felt and what you're receiving is what creates confusion. Because the physical closeness was real, but it wasn't a bridge to emotional intimacy. It was in many ways a substitute for it. One of the most disorienting parts of this kind of connection is how real it feels in the moment, and yet how little it seems to hold once you step outside of it. You walk away from an interaction thinking, there's something deep here. This isn't surface level. And yet, when you try to build something consistent from it, it feels like there's nothing solid to stand on. That's because what you're experiencing is often the illusion of depth rather than depth itself. And to be clear, this illusion isn't fake in the sense that it's meaningless. It feels real because there is emotion present. There is connection in those moments. But the depth you're perceiving is being created through intensity, not through sustained emotional intimacy. Real intimacy takes time. It's built through repeated experiences of honesty, consistency, and emotional safety. It's not just about how someone shows up in a single moment. It's about how they show up over time, especially when things aren't easy or exciting. But with someone who avoids vulnerability, those deeper layers are often missing. Instead, what they offer are glimpses, moments that feel profound, conversations that touch the surface of something meaningful, expressions of emotion that seem to hint at something deeper. And because those moments are rare and powerful, they stand out. They feel significant. You start to piece them together, creating a narrative in your mind that says, there's more here. They just need time. They just need to feel safe. And that's where the illusion strengthens, because you're filling in the gaps with potential rather than reality. You're focusing on what you felt in those intense moments, rather than what is consistently being shown to you outside of them. And those two things can be very different. The truth is, depth isn't measured by how intense a moment feels. It's measured by how consistently someone is willing to show up, to communicate, to be emotionally available even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. And this is where the disconnect happens. Because someone who struggles with emotional closeness may be able to create moments that feel incredibly deep, but they can't sustain the behaviors that actually build real intimacy. They can't consistently hold space for emotional connection. They can't stay present when things require vulnerability over time. So what you're left with is a series of high-impact moments that feel meaningful, but don't connect into a stable foundation. It's like reading powerful chapters from a book that never fully comes together. And the danger in that is you start to invest in the story, not the reality. You believe in what it could be based on what you've experienced in flashes, rather than what it actually is on a day-to-day basis. And that's why it can feel so hard to let go. Because you're not just letting go of what is, you're letting go of what it felt like it could become, but real intimacy doesn't rely on potential. It's built on consistency. And without that consistency, no matter how deep it may feel in isolated moments, it remains just that, an illusion that can't sustain something real. There's a certain emotional tension that builds when you're around someone who is inconsistent in how they show up. You can feel it, even if you can't immediately explain it. One moment, everything feels aligned, the conversation flows, the connection feels natural, and there's a sense of ease between you. And then without warning, that ease disappears. Something shifts, and you're left trying to find your footing again. This is where instability begins to take hold, because as human beings, we are wired to seek patterns. We look for consistency in behavior to understand where we stand with someone. It's how we build trust. It's how we feel safe. When someone responds to us in predictable ways, we relax into the connection. We don't have to question every interaction. We can simply experience it. But when someone's behavior is unpredictable, that sense of safety is disrupted. You don't know which version of them you're going to get. The one who is warm, engaged, and fully present, or the one who is distant, distracted, and emotionally unavailable. And because you've experienced both, you can't easily dismiss either. So you start adjusting yourself. You become more aware of what you say, how you say it, how they might respond. You analyze conversations after they happen. You look for clues in their tone, their timing, their level of effort. You try to anticipate shifts before they happen, as if somehow you can stabilize the situation through awareness. But the truth is, this instability isn't something you can control, because it's not coming from anything you're doing wrong. It's coming from their internal conflict. Their inconsistency reflects their own discomfort with closeness, not your value or your behavior. Still, the impact on you is very real. You begin to feel emotionally off balance. The connection no longer feels like a place where you can relax. It feels like something you have to manage. And over time, that creates a kind of quiet anxiety. You're not fully at ease even in the good moments because part of you is aware that those moments might not last. And that awareness changes how you experience the connection. Instead of being present, you become cautious. Instead of feeling secure, you feel uncertain. You're always on some level bracing for a shift. This is why so many people find themselves drained in these dynamics. It's not just the inconsistency itself, it's the constant emotional adjustment that comes with it. The effort of trying to make sense of something that doesn't follow a clear pattern. The energy it takes to stay connected to someone who isn't consistently meeting you in the same space. And the hardest part is you might still feel strongly about them. Because when they do show up, it feels good. It reminds you of why you were drawn to them in the first place. But those moments don't erase the instability, they exist alongside it. And over time, you're left with a connection that feels intense, but not secure. Engaging, but not grounding. And without that sense of stability, it becomes incredibly difficult to build something that truly supports you. At the core of all of this behavior, the intensity, the distance, the inconsistency, there's something much quieter driving it. Something that isn't always visible on the surface, but shapes everything you experience with them. Fear. Not the obvious kind. Not the kind that's openly expressed or easy to identify. This is a deeper, more internal fear, one that often goes unspoken, even by the person feeling it. It's the fear of losing control, of being emotionally exposed, of depending on someone and then being hurt or abandoned. And what makes this so complex is that this fear can exist at the same time as a genuine desire for connection. Part of them wants closeness. They enjoy the moments you share. They feel the chemistry, the pull, the emotional spark. But another part of them is constantly scanning for risk, constantly asking, what happens if this goes too far? What happens if I lose myself in this? What happens if I get hurt? So they manage that fear in the only way they know how, by controlling the distance. When things feel light, exciting, and within their comfort zone, they move closer. They allow themselves to engage, to express, to create those intense moments that feel so real. But as soon as the connection starts to deepen, when it begins to require emotional consistency, openness, or commitment, that's when the fear is triggered. And instead of confronting that fear directly, they respond by pulling away. Not necessarily in a dramatic or intentional way, but in subtle shifts. They become less available, less expressive, less consistent. It's their way of regaining a sense of control over something that's starting to feel unpredictable, because emotional intimacy for them represents uncertainty. It means relying on someone else. It means allowing another person to influence how they feel. And that level of dependence can feel incredibly uncomfortable if they've learned at some point in their life that closeness leads to pain. So rather than risk that pain again, they keep one foot out the door. And this is why their behavior can feel so contradictory. They're not completely closed off, but they're not fully open either. They exist in this middle space where they can experience connection, but only up to a point. Only as long as it doesn't threaten their sense of independence or emotional safety. For you, this can be incredibly confusing because you're trying to understand their actions from a place of wanting clarity and stability. You're looking for consistency, for reassurance, for something that tells you where you stand. But their behavior isn't driven by clarity, it's driven by protection. And protection doesn't always look logical from the outside. It looks like mixed signals. It looks like intensity followed by distance. It looks like someone who feels close one moment and far away the next. But underneath all of that is a simple truth. They're not avoiding you. They're avoiding the fear that comes with letting someone truly matter. And until they're willing to face that fear themselves, there's a limit to how close they can allow anyone to get.